It's on.
Hello.
There you go. There you go.
All right, look at this. My name is Joanne Swenson. I'm with the Oregon Area Historical Society, and we're happy to be here to present a presentation on how things were back in the early days of Oregon, if you will, and what you might see now. Dixie Brown is here with me from the Oregon Area Historical Society, and answer any questions that you might have as we go along. Casey is going to be kind of following along on the script, and Dixie is going to keep our slides moving. So I'm happy to see, I do recognize a few names out there, a few faces, so, and others have come up and jogged my memory, so feel free to do that if you wish. So we're going to get started with the first slide, which kind of goes back to tell about Oregon's origins. And the initial area was first called the town of Rome, and it was a large area. But it started getting peeled off into separate chunks, separate townships, if you will. So the first one, and the town of Rome was named Rome because a lot of people came from New York, and Rome was one of the places out in Oneida County in New York. So they just adopted that. But in 1847, a man named Roselle Babbitt decided that wanted to develop a separate entity and call it the town of Oregon, which he did. And at the same time, or around that time, the town of Fitchburg came into being, although at that time it was called Greenfield. They changed the name to Fitchburg because there was a Greenfield down by Milwaukee somewhere, and they didn't want to get confused with that. So that left the town of Dunn, which came later in the following year in 1848 and organized the township of Dunn. So now we're just left with one little piece left of the town of Rome, and that they renamed to Pleasant Springs, and that the town of Rome actually ceased to exist as an entity. Okay, go to the next slide if I can get my pages up here. Separate that for me, they don't want to come here. Thank you. So, what brought people to this area in the first place? Some of them came, of course, overland from the eastern United States. Some were coming as immigrants from Europe. Mostly those came that were farmers or agricultural based. They liked this land because it had an abundance of trees that they could build their homes from. The soil was particularly adaptable for farming. It had a kind of a loamy texture to the top. Sand and gravel underneath provided a lot of drainage for farming. And there were a lot of springs and creeks that provided the water sources. Rooney, next one. Rooney was one of the first settlers. Bartlett or Bartley, I've seen it both ways, was actually given credit for being the first settler in the area. He settled in the Rutland area as we know it now. He was born in Maryland in 1795. He married and had quite a large family and decided that he was going to move out this way. And it took him a while to get here. There were several stops along the way in Indiana and Ohio. But when he got here, he filed a claim, built a log cabin. That log cabin was located near the junction of a mail route from Madison to Janesville, and what is known as the Old Lead Trail. You may have heard that name before. The lead trail ran from Mineral Point to Milwaukee, and it was the route on which they hauled the lead ore from the mines out in Mineral Point. That area right now would be along the, or in the area of the old Stage Road and Union Road. After he built his home, he brought his family there in the following year in 1842. 1843, he added a frame structure to the existing building, and it became known as the Pioneer Hotel. It was the favorite stopping point along that old lead trail for the teamsters that were driving their teams to Milwaukee. It was also a place where they held religious services, because at the time they didn't have any other place large enough to hold enough people. Mr. Rooney came to a tragic end, actually, in 1846. He was going into Madison, apparently, and on his way back, his wagon overturned on what they called then what they called Breakneck Hill, and he was killed in that accident. I don't know about Breakneck Hill. I tend to think it's probably as Nine Spring Hill as we know it today. Are you doing, you have the map? Okay. As far as the Village of Oregon, Robert Thompson was probably the first person who came into what became the Village of Oregon. In 1841, he built a log cabin along the banks of a creek that's now known as Thompson's Creek, and it's still there. And it's located near Janesville Street and Perry Parkway. Robert died in 1882, leaving his property to his daughters, who in turn sold it to George Thompson. George was a nephew of Robert's. He was born in 1847. He was raised by aunts. His parents, actually, his mother passed away when he was only a month old. After attending the university for a year, he decided to become a carpenter, and he built wagons. He also built that large home in 1889, while he was still living in the log cabin until the house was finished. And that house has been removed. Well, it would have stood right next to the Wisco property on Janesville Street. It went down through the generations until it reached Ellen Robinson, and her son Keith inherited it from her, and Wisco was looking to expand their operation down there and needed the land, but they didn't need the house. And thankfully, they didn't destroy the house or tear it down, but they sought out someone to come and move it. And those people were Jim and Sandy Ness, and they moved that huge Victorian house out to Highway MM on the way to Brooklyn. You'll see it if you go there. It's up on the hill off the road, and they did extensive remodeling to it, and we had a chance to go in and look at the insides. It's absolutely gorgeous. Probably wouldn't recognize it, but they added a lot of modern conveniences to it and so forth.
Not in your way.
Carol's not in, say, but Rico is in?
I'm on 10.
We could have been Rico?
The land that
Transfer you to Rico.
is occupied by the now Village of Oregon was entered from the government in the early 1840s. First purchased at $1.25 an acre by I.M. Bennett. He sold it to a man called James Koval for $100, so he made a good profit at that time. And James Koval built a house on the lawn of what now is the Red Brick School. And he had his first shoe shop there. Then he sold it to Charles Waterman. Now, Charles Waterman owned already a 200-acre farm. And that section that Waterman ended up with ran basically from North Main Street, north of the Methodist Church, all the way down to where you'd know as Maria's Pizza, east to Union Street, that would encompass all of Spring Street, and then further on east, even out towards the marsh. As we said, Oregon was first known as Rome Corners. But then the railroad came through in 1864, and their map said Oregon. So that's what they put up on the sign, was Oregon, and eventually it was adopted when Oregon became incorporated in 1881. Manuel Wolfe was the first village president. Can you pass that one?
We're on the map right now.
Okay. So with an abundance of land that Waterman had, he actually donated a lot of the land. He donated the land which the Presbyterian Church, when it was on North Main Street, was built. And he donated, well, his son actually, his nephew Justin actually donated the area that we call the Waterman Park, or the Triangle Park, or the Downtown Park, whatever name we give to it. Charles and his wife raised the nephew, Justin. And Justin devoted his attention to farming, basically, and raising horses. He had superior stallions that he shipped all over the country. Justin, when he married Annie Osborne, and when she died, he had a big iron gate built in her honor and dedicated that park to her. We have pictures of the home. Okay. All righty. You're with me. The village of Oregon was actually a vibrant farming community at one time. Merchants and tradesmen set up shop that would serve the agricultural community. And the railroad provided a means of travel and transit, making Oregon the center of an enlarged trade territory. And at one point, Oregon was one of the major shipping points for cattle out of this area. Following World War II, the introduction of automobiles and new highways made a big change in the complexion of the village of Oregon, turning it somewhat from an agricultural community into a suburban one. Got pictures of the railroad and transition. So we can look at a little bit of the agricultural function that took place. And I'm hoping you're on the slide that shows some of these very old utensils that they had. They didn't have anything mechanized at that time, so it was a lot of hand labor with these kind of tools where they plowed the land and they tilled the land, they raked and so forth, harvested things, but eventually more mechanical means came into being, kind of replacing what they used to then have horses and oxen, sometimes using them to pull the wagons and some of the harvesting equipment. What was rather nice about the time I lived on the farm and grew up on the farm was it was a neighbor friendly area, and they helped one another. And whether one farmer had any kind of misfortune like a fire or the tornadoes or so forth, farmers would come to help and bring people in and clean up whatever they needed to do, but they helped one another. It was wonderful to see. And I can remember growing up when my folks had a threshing machine, which at that time, not every farmer in the neighborhood had that. And they went from one farm to the other. The farmers would come and take in one farmer's crops, and then maybe the next week they would do another. So it was a time when it was your turn to host the workers that came, the threshing crew as we called them. The farmers' wives had to get involved too, and they got up very early in the morning to make this noonday meal, and it tell you. But I remember it well, that even one lady came and churned butter at that time. But they put out this huge meal. And at one particular time when I was probably a younger kid, my mother had pies, and she had baked a pie, and I had my eye on this piece of pie. But we had strict orders that nobody would get a piece of pie or any kind of food off that table until all the men who were doing the threshing had their turn at it. But I kept my eye on that piece of pie, and as they were leaving, there was still one piece left. But then one man came back up and took that piece of pie. Etched in my memory, just etched in my memory. On the next slide, though, you get a look at what this equipment looks like today that they put in. Huge equipment, huge tractors. I mean, I live out on 138, but I often take the back road into Oregon when I want to visit the north side. And if you get behind one of those, there's not that many places maybe that you can get around them. And you might get a little frustrated doing it, but you know, until they can find a place where they can pull off enough so that you can get by, I guess you just have to take a deep breath and remember this is where our food is coming from. I'd say maybe sadly, we don't see a lot of the family farms anymore. It's evolved into corporate farming, large farms, large dairy farms. You know, it used to be that if a farm family had some sons or whatever, one of them would eventually take over the farm and continue it. But that isn't the case so much today. For one thing, it's hard work. The hours are demanding, and you are up early in the morning, especially if you're tending to a dairy herd. You're up early in the morning, and you go sometimes past sunset. And I remember we never took a vacation. Well, I take that back. One day out of the year, my dad and my mother and me, they would pack a lunch and we'd go to the state fair. That was before the interstate was there too, by the way. And so we could visit the fair. My dad, of course, had to see all the new equipment and farming and the cattle and so forth. And my mother and I particularly liked the flowers. And we would go out to the parking lot and unpack our lunch and have our lunch out there. And then come back for some more trips around the fairgrounds. And then our parting treat was a cream puff. And it still is today, isn't it? But as a dairy farmer, if you sold your milk to a creamery, you couldn't always, depend on a good price. So, at that point, a lot of the young folks, the young farmers that grew up on farms found going on to other higher education and other careers. But going back to the early days, we had a blacksmith shop in town. It was on North Main Street, and would have been right next to the Hitchie Park. And it operated under the name of Starbucker and Sprague, and that's where you would have your horses shod and so forth. It was demolished in 1987, kind of, I guess, a sign of the times that we didn't need that kind of service anymore. The advent of cars kind of made horses not the primary means of transportation. Likewise, the livery stable. The first livery stable was operated by Fisher and Barton, and it was located near the water tower. And I didn't know that, but I remember seeing the one that was on Jefferson Street across from the bank at the time. And that one was operated by Frank Fincher when I knew in the days that I worked at the bank. But it became a thing of the past as well. speaking of dairy, this first, I like this first slide. Quite often, it was the farmer's wife that ended up with the milking chores because the men were always out in the field. And that meant that somebody had to milk those cows, and that ended up falling to the farmer's wife to do that. They, like I said, they sold their milk to dairies. In the early days, it was held in cans, metal cans, and you cooled those in a cement tank filled with really cold water. And then we also had a milk truck and a milk route that went around and picked up cans from the farmers. And I remember it was a 2-level thing. So you had, you were up about this high, and then there was another level up there, and my brothers would be throwing those cans up there on, filled cans up on the milk truck. And then taking them into the creameries. Later on, bulk tanks became more common in the farmers, in the milk houses. So they were huge tanks that kept the milk moving and cold, but you came with a bulk truck and hooked up to the tank and transferred it into the milk truck or the bulk tank, and that took it off into the creamery. Some of the dairies that we had, though, back in the days when it was circulated and delivered around town, the first one probably that comes to mind is the Netherwood Dairy. It was located just north of the Red Brick School, and he operated a herd there as well as doing the bottling. But initially, he went around town with cans in the back of a cart drawn by 2 horses. His horses were Tom and Jerry, and those horses knew the route just as well as Perry did. And later on, then they bottled this, and then you had your delivery person that came by with bottle. Some of the other dairies, and you might know some of the ones too that I missed, but I know Durffer Brothers had a dairy, and the Gefkes bottled milk and delivered it, and I'm pretty sure there were a few others in the area as well. Buck and Bell Pledger, who you might know more familiarly, of running the nursing home on North Main Street, but they operated, they had a creamery, and that creamery was located where the village hall, the old village hall to us now, that would be on Park Street across from the park. That's where it was located, and it was moved to North Main Street to make way for the village hall to be built there in 1941. Dairies now are major operations. If you ever have a chance to visit one of these large dairy operations, and if you were raised on a farm, you'll appreciate it even more. But now, herds that we had were maybe 30 to 40 cows at the most. These operations now probably have 100 or more cows. And they don't milk just like we did morning and evening. It's a round-the-clock routine. And they have an operation where these cows come in and they go into these little stalls, so to speak. They're fed and they're milked at the same time as that goes around. So it's not a totally hands-off operation, but the milk goes directly from the cow now through pipes to the cooling tanks. And I know at one farm they even have their own bulk truck, so it goes right from the tank, from the cows through the tank to into the bulk truck. Let's turn our attention to some of the Oregon businesses, and maybe you'll have some recollections of what was available back then. But I go to the Netherwood block, Now, there's two things called Netherwood Hall and Netherwood Block. When I refer to Netherwood Block, it's the one on the south side of the monument now, as we know it, or the square as they called it back then. And it first housed a hotel. We talked about Mr. Waterman. That would have been part of his land. But the first hotel was built there and called the Oregon Exchange Hotel. It did well for a while, but it kind of failed, and it was purchased by Chandler, Robert Chandler. And he called it the Chandler Hotel or the Chandler House. And that was back in 1845. When that burnt, around 1898, Charles Netherwood built the Netherwood Block. And that block, I referred pretty much to the building that exists there with, right now, the dental office and Senior Peppers. But at the time, if you would look at it, you could almost picture three separate areas of that building. So in 1898 or in the early 1900s, the there was a grocery store, a Notion store, on the west corner. And in the middle section, there was a barber shop at that time, and the city meat market brought up the east end. Above there, in the second story, there was a lawyer's office. Haskell and Getz had a law office there. Charles Martin had a cigar factory up there. And above the city meat market on the far east side, there was this large hall that was rented out by the Modern Woodman for public events. Recall reading in Florence Paulson's book that hall in 1941 was the site of the centennial, and they had large gatherings there and dances and so forth, and one was held at that place. In around 1913, Milton Wishaw Sr. had a jewelry store. I think it was on the west end at that time. Later, Dr. Roysum and Dr. Kellogg came into that area, and they left and built the clinic on the north end. Dr. Ducatine joined them at that time. And then Norm Champion and Earl Granzy bought the place. They had a heating and sheet metal business, and they used that as their office. But they also did a lot of renovations, and included what was upstairs. They turned those into apartments. Today, the center section from 1916 till 1941 had the library. And later, I remember Winona's Beauty Shop was there, H&R Block. We made ceramics there. I think Brandy White had her shop there. And then Dr. Mark Nelson and Mike Nelson had their dental office in the far west side. Let's see. I mentioned Charles Netherwood and all the land that he had, and the land that that first hotel was built on, the Exchange Hotel, was built on his land. But there were also other hotels in the Oregon area. One of them was One of them was the Grand Hotel. The Grand Hotel would have been located on I'm sure most of you remember when the old corner store was there, on the corner of Park Street, when Park Street went through, and North Main Street. It was claimed to be one of the fanciest hotels back in that day. The third hotel actually was the one on Market and Lincoln Street, and it's now where we have our Oregon Area Museum. But it was the favorite stopping point for the salesmen that came by rail, because the depot is located right across the street from it, that they would stop and stay at the hotel while they made their rounds around Oregon peddling their merchandise. That hotel burned and was later rebuilt and used as a warehouse, and ultimately became the lumber yard. You probably remember Oregon Lumber Company being there, later Chase Lumber Company. The museum, the Historical Society, through Florence Paulson, bought the building when it was in serious disrepair, and donated it to the Oregon Area Historical Society. And for the next several months, probably even a couple years, we had a number of volunteers that came in and literally restored that old building into what we have today. Took a lot of effort, and it would be unrecognizable if you saw it back when we purchased it in 1987. Now, today, we have a new hotel on the east side of Oregon, southeast side of Oregon, the Sleep Inn, which is across from what used to be the Waterfall Hotel and Waterfall Restaurant, landmark for many years. That Sleep Inn just, I think it, around 2018, 2019 opened for business. And of course, the restaurant and the motel were burnt down. They made way for our Culvers. But I don't know, we waited years for Culvers to come, but I still miss the Waterfall Restaurant, because so many memories were made at the Waterfall Restaurant. It was a gathering spot for everybody. And my husband always stopped there on his way home to get all the gossip, and come home and tell me what was going on in Oregon. The only problem was he'd never get the names right. He never remembered the names, so I heard the gossip, but I didn't know it belonged to it, so it was a little meaningless. Now on North Main Street, Charles Netherwood, in about the same time, around 1898, built what he called Netherwood Hall. And Netherwood Hall also burned down, and he replaced it should go back and tell you, it was built originally in 1868, burned in 1873. He rebuilt it then, and he added a second story to it, but fire struck again in 1898. But Mr. Netherwood was not deterred. He built it again, and this time it adopted the name of the Phoenix, meaning rising from the ashes. But that building survived for many years until it was torn down. It's now a little park on the corner of Jefferson and North Main Street. The Bank of Oregon had started out with a small corner of that building, gradually grew down the North Main Street side. I remember Wishoff's Jewelry kind of came in, Lawson's Drugstore came into being at that time, and they expanded and they built a motor bank and a drive-up. First the drive-up that was attached to the bank building, and then the motor bank on the other side of the alley, after they acquired a couple of the houses that sat on. So I worked at the bank for 20 years. I know Marge from the bank, and not Astrid. Your first name?
Ann.
Ann.
Yeah.
I was close. And Ann worked there as well, so they have stories, and I could tell you stories, but I'm gonna save it for another presentation, because it probably would take the rest of your afternoon just talking about some of the things that we had. But to give you just a hint, it was, you know, when I started, there was probably 8 people in total, and I don't know how many it ended up with, or how many are there today, but it eventually went through consolidations with first Valley Bank. Valley Bank then got picked up by M&I Bank, and M&I Bank then got picked up by BMO, so there we are today. But it's a long story. But a sadder story is what happened to the First National Bank, which was next door, well, down the street on North Main Street. And it opened in 1914. Arthur Schultz was the first president. C.N. Chilton was the cashier, and it operated at 113 North Main Street until 1929, and I'm sure you can fill in the rest of the story. And that what happened in 1929 when the stock market crashed, a lot of the banks closed. The Bank of Oregon survived. The First National Bank did not. It never reopened. So we had other people that came in. The post office, I think, was one of the first ones that came in after that. And other businesses, Hagstrom's Insurance was there. Lyle Beggs had an office there. Anyone remember Ginger and Roger Nelson? Tell me what they ran. What kind of a job?
Cowgirl and cowboy.
There you go. Kind of a Western saddles, Western clothing and so forth, yeah. And Ginger was a very good hairdresser too, by the way, but she didn't operate that building. Real estate offices, I think Russ Bavery, Al Gazdner had an office there at one time. Recreational Concepts maybe was the latest before it is, and it would tell me, so wine reserve now, is that what it is now? Another one of the early businesses was a millinery shop. A millinery shop, a person who makes hats. The lady that ran it was Neely DeJane, and she had a thriving business because back in the early days, hats were a must for the ladies. If they were going to church or even out to any other social event, they had to have a hat, and it usually had to kind of match your outfit. So she custom made these hats. Some of them were really big. She decorated them with feathers and fake flowers, and some really outlandish ones that you see, but you could kind of, she would customize it to the outfit. Sometimes would, even come and see the dress that you wanted it to match and make a hat to fit the bill. And she operated that, started in like 1902. Over on South Main Street, the first building that you see on South Main Street is the McDermott Building and the J.P. Connor Building. Interesting stories about those two gentlemen. They both were in the mercantile business. They both had, clothes and food and groceries and so forth. And they were competitors. They were strong competitors with each other. Bernard McDermott was the first one to make a move from a small shop that he had there. He moved it out into the middle of where we would probably see the monument now. And he continued to operate it there while he was building this building. And he started that in 1899 when he started erecting that building. In 1908, J.P. Connor, who had similarly a small shop, moved it out into the middle of the square and decided he was going to build next to the McDermott Building. And like it or not, he made it look almost like that was one continuous building. If you look at it today, you might think that's one building. It's really two buildings. It was built at two different times, 1899 and then 1908. But they continued to be competitors. They still operated the same kind of businesses side by side. Down the street from there was the Marvin Hardware. And so, of course, it was a hardware store on the lower half of the building. The upstairs is where the lodge had their meeting area at one time. The lodge was actually in two different, or in three. They had three different locations for the lodge. The first one was in a small one-story building that would be located where Maria's Pizza is. And that was the first one. The second one then was in the Netherwood Hall, in the upper level of the Netherwood Hall, which we just looked at, until that building burned, of course, and then they moved to Marvin's location on South Main Street, and then ultimately they built a new lodge, I think in the 1960s, on Spring Street and Park Street, just back of us here. Okay, now I'm going off script. What's next?
Where you starting? Starting from there?
Where am I? After the Marvin, after, I call it 44? What have I got up there? Tell me.
Yeah, Dorn Hardware.
Oh, Dorn Hardware. Well, that, of course, is the now version of what was the hardware store when Marvin, yeah.
There you go, on the fire side. We got Sunny's.
I think I'm totally off script here, but just tell me what I got here. and
Yes,
I'll wing it. Okay, I'm gonna look at this.
Sunny's kickback.
Okay. Oh, yeah. So I suppose I should go back to the J.P. Connor building. You can kind of see where it stops. One has the green awning and one has the red awning. Today, the Connor building is where Sunny's is. And then next door to it is the Kickback Cafe and the Chocolate Caper. Okay, next. This is Kronk's Opera Shop, Opera House. And that was the place to be in the early day. They had plays, they had graduations held there, they had dances, silent movies were held there, and it was the place of entertainment in the early days. The next business to operate in that location would have been what we now know as the Firefly. But it was a store. We had, yes, IGA. And does anyone remember when, I'm not sure if it was IGA on one side, it was Home-Owned Store at one time, and on one side, it actually had a door that went between the two sides of that building, and Dave Griffith operated a dry goods store out of that with shoes and shirts and clothing. The Home Cafe, my favorite place when I was working, is now where Torkhorse is located, but it was operated by a number of people. I think, I don't remember this, but I think Daisy Booth had his restaurant there at one time. Anyone remember that far back?
Yep.
Who said yes?
The restaurant.
I'm sorry?
The restaurant?
The restaurant, yeah. Yeah, Daisy Booth had a place called Daisy's. In my particular recollection, it was Doris Schnabel and Bert West who ran it. And when they went out, I think a couple by the name of Gilbert's, Bush's was in there. Remember the Bush family that came in? I don't know if they were before Bob Markham ran it for a while. And then eventually now we are seeing the site of the insurance, Torhorst Insurance. Okay, so we're back to the park. This was the sign I referenced, the Annie Waterman Memorial Park that Justin Waterman had erected after his wife died, and they dedicated that land in her memory and for a park. An early picture of the bandstand standing on the park behind the old cannon. And here it is today, a new band shelter. There's the concert. Do you find yourself in there, Mary?
Yeah, well,
She's back there in the back, I think, or maybe behind one of the pillars. There's another shot of it here. And
like Jim Baxter, to the right of Jim Baxter.
I'm sorry?
I'm to the right of Jim
You're
Baxter.
to the
You know
right
what
of Jim
is?
Baxter.
He's a conductor,
Yes, right. Okay, so you're in there somewhere. What did you play, Mary?
fruit piccolo.
And again, the cannon used to sit on the western side of the park. It's now got a nice little display there in the corner, right across from the old bicycle factory. Back in the day, if you remember the people on the top left, that's Don and Bonnie Bates, and they operated the Bon Don. Bon Don hair shop for many years. Don was really an illustrious person in this area. He was very talented. He also designed a lot of homes that you're going to see around, I think 7 or 8 houses. They're distinctive houses. They are not like your common houses that had, different architectural design to them. Don and Bonnie sold the business to Jim and Bev Bossingham, who ran it for several years. It is now the Pro Modern Salon, and actually my great niece runs that, Carrie, has that shop now. But I think you'll find that picture to the right interesting. That definitely was a then picture. I'm not quite sure what she's getting done, but is it a permanent? Is it a permanent? Yeah. But that's what you had to go through if you wanted a permanent back then. Next. Here's some pictures of the old fire trucks at one time. I can't tell you. Somebody could probably tell you. Probably 40s, 1940s. And then the new fire station, they maintained the bell that I think is still there. This is a slide depicting the post office or the postal carriers. So in the top, this would have been Florence Paulson's father or grandfather, not quite sure, can't tell, didn't know him. But he had a horse and cart that he delivered the mail with. And that was probably before, and the post office behind, and you can see it's behind the Netherwood Block building. So I'm not sure where it operated out of. Maybe it might be the back end of that building. There was a post office there. But they used to have to go up to the railroad track and get the mail sacks from the train. The train came through and they had this arm that reached out, and they put the bag of mail on that arm. And then whoever was in charge of it would have to go pull that sack off the arm and bring it back down and sort through it, I presume, and then get it loaded up to be delivered. Now, I can't tell whether that was just local delivery or whether he actually went into the country. I'm not sure. I'm not sure how the people in the country got their mail at that time. But I do remember in the lower left when the post office was in this old First National Bank building. And it later, when it left there, it went over to where the Krause Donovan Estate Law Partners are located now, right across the street from here. This picture is one that I can remember, 1966. Anybody want to name these people? Far left was Eileen Olson, Stella Beeson, Gordon Beeson, and Gordy Hanson, who was the postmaster.
The post office?
Uh-huh. Yeah,
Gordy Beeson.
Gordy Beeson and Gordon Hanson.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That's Ron Harrington.
I'm sorry, that's Ron Harrington. I'm sorry.
I recognize him possibly like husband.
Okay. Should have read it off from there, huh? And then the post office in its current place. This is the swimming pool. The swimming pool originally built by the firemen, I believe, up on Kaiser Park. Kaiser Park is located up there. Kaiser had the land that the swimming pool was built on. I remember taking my kids to the outdoor version of the swimming pool when they were very young, and they take them in the morning when I go to work about 8 o'clock, and they'd shiver because the water was so cold.
No heaters.
Yeah, no heaters, nothing like that. And then the new building today. Here's the lodge. A little bit out of order, I guess, but there's the first temple, like I told you. It was where Maria's Pizza is located. Then it was on the second floor of the Netherwood Hall building until that building burned. And then they moved to what was, I described back in the earlier slide as Marvin's Hardware. And you'll see in that picture, the emblem, the lodge emblem, is still up there on the top of that building. And this is their new building. I think the new building was built in around the mid-60s. Here's the village hall. The village hall in the first slide occupied, that was the village, what became the village hall, that center section. It was a school. But that center section in the second slide is being moved to its location behind the Netherwood block, back where Maria's Pizza would have been, or in that alley at least. And that became the village hall until it moved to the Park Street across from the park in 1941 when that was built. I went to school in first grade in that building because at that time the school up the hill was overcrowded and they had to have extra space, and so they had the first grade, I think just 2 first grade classes there in the front 2 buildings, or front 2. The side, you'll see the little stairway that went up on the side, that came into one of the classrooms as well. My teachers were Mrs. Olson, which would be Pat Anderson's mother, Pat Lyman Anderson's wife Pat's mother, and Mary Smith. Don Smith, she was a teacher for a long time, but she taught first grade down here as well. Okay.
That was a jail too.
And yes, it was the jail.
Why does Karen know that?
I was never in it. I saw it.
Good point, and an interesting side point to that is that George Johnson was
Yeah, the policeman.
the policeman, and he lived in the jail for a while.
Constable.
Was he constable? He was a policeable. I'm policeable. He was a policeable, yeah.
We called him Georgie Porgy.
Georgie, yes, and he had a son, George, and a daughter,
Yeah.
and they lived in that and slept in the cell. But that's where they stayed overnight until they found lodging. Yeah.
There's my mother went to Arizona and she went to a cemetery there and there was a name poster or whatever you want to call it on the ground. It said George Johnson, hanged by mistake.
Oh, well, luckily our George didn't have that outcome. Martin's Tavern was also a bowling alley. And then remember I told you Charles Martin had the cigar factory at one point, but when he left that business, he opened up this tavern along with a bowling alley. And then here's your newer version of it. And then on the lower portion, that's not the newest probably, I haven't been in there in years, but it's still in existence today, and I guess there's still some bowling. Marge, weren't you a bowler?
Yeah, still do, still
And
go.
you still go here?
Yeah,
Great. And does it look like the one on the left, on the bottom?
yep.
Okay.
Well, they've got different background now, but yeah,
Uh-huh.
it's definitely the same.
What you got next?
That was 3 alleys?
How many
Two
lanes?
alleys, wasn't it?
No,
Two, wasn't there? Just two.
Two.
But there's 8 now.
They're not about the original, aren't you?
I've set pins in there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. What was it, how many alleys were there, Marge, back then? 6 or 8?
8 right
8,
now.
okay.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the picture on the left is a reference to the leagues, the bowling leagues that were formed and bowled there.
Sportsman's Bar bowling alley in the basement?
No.
I don't know about that. Martin's Bar definitely had one in the basement.
I think it was.
Remember Shorty Erford?
Oh, sure.
Yes, I do.
Okay, well, this is Shorty down there sitting on the Coke machine. The picture on the top is the station, and I know it's a very bad picture of it, but that was the station that sat there on the corner where we have Little Buddy's popcorn now. We can go a little further. You haven't, still got time? I got a few more. I could go all day, but I have something to do tonight. Okay, we're at the museum now, and I just wanted to show you the display that we have downstairs depicting an older kitchen. Now, I know Dixie has replaced that table with a newer one and probably redecorated it, but some of the items that you're gonna see in there are from the very early days. The picture on the lower right might use somebody's kitchen, not mine, but it's more modern than the one that you see depicted there. Let's look at a little more. Oh, no?
Do you want me to go forward?
Go back now. I just want to point out that on the right-hand side of that top picture are the 2 refrigerators that came into being. Before there was refrigerators, people, we'll go to the next one. They cut ice out on Lake Harriet and cut those into blocks and kept them on straw, I think, in this sawdust, okay, in this shanty that they built out there. And then they would sell ice, delivered it, I think it was the Culp Brothers that had the ice delivery. And you had this little sign that would say, I want 25 pounds, 50 pounds, 75 pounds, whatever. And the homeowner would put that sign up, and Ernie or Ed would know how much ice to leave at that place. And that would go in these little contraptions. The one on the middle section there, the top part of that is where the ice was stored. If you open that bottom drawer, that would be the dip tray where the melted ice would drop into. Then on the left-hand side, if you open that door, you'd have some shelves where you could actually store something and keep it cool. This is a little bit newer. This one was totally non-electric. This one was electrified, and it had that condenser, I guess, unit you call it, that big bubble on the top that created the cold air. And there's the place where they kept their stuff cold down below. I don't even see any, I think there was shelves there, but I'm not sure that we had them in this picture. Our refrigerators today can do just about anything, including telling you that you're out of milk and you need to go get it and so forth. I'm not going there. This was an old cook stove that we have down there, and it operated with wood. You had to put wood in it. You didn't have, and the oven was in the middle. You could bake in it, but it did not have any temperature settings on it. You kind of had to, somebody said you stuck your hand in, and if it felt warm, it was at a certain degree, and if it was a little too hot to stay in there, then you had reached your baking temperature. But on top, we have, there's one thing I'm not sure if you could see it, in the middle of the cook stove on the top was a waffle maker. Looks almost exactly what you see in your hotels, their little kitchenettes today, that they can do the little flip thing. And that one does the same thing, only you had to put that on the stove instead of it being electric. The next reiteration of that we have on display is an electric range. Okay, let's go to the next one. And here's how they did their washing in the day. That's a very old washing machine. Kind of over on the right-hand side, some newer versions of the washing machine.
Oh, right.
And the lower picture, you scrubbed on a washboard. If you weren't playing music on it, you washed your clothes on it. And then, of course, we have the modern ones today. I'm just going to talk, this is a range of telephones through the years. But the one that I remember most is the one up on the top left. It was the one that hung on the wall. And a little crank on the side and the earphone on the left-hand side. And in the country, at least, you had party lines. You didn't have a private line. You did have a number. Ours was 95F12. And it meant that when on our party line, if you heard one long ring and two short rings, that was us. But it rang in everybody's house, so if anybody wanted to listen in, they could, and they did. Let's go to the next one. Music, at this time, like I said, the place back then was was Kron's. Picture in the middle are two of my favorites. One is Harvey Berkey and the other is Max Gaffney with their instruments. When I was growing up, my mother became kind of the barber on Sand Hill Road, and the Berkeys lived where Kopke's greenhouse is now. There were three brothers and Mabel, and they would always come for their, I imagine, monthly haircuts, if you will. But they'd always bring their instruments, and so when they got their haircuts and so forth, and I should mention that on the other side of us was Helmer and Pete Larson. So Pete played the accordion, Pete Larson did the accordion, then we had the fiddle, and my brother-in-law, I think, played banjo and harmonica. So when they get done with their haircuts, they play music for their haircut. But it was great. It was great to have them, and I look forward to that. Wish they could grow their hair faster. We just acquired a player piano, which you see down here with Jeannie standing beside it, from Doris Gary. Thank you. And this is kind of a hit now. We've had some school tours come through in the last few weeks, and that's one of the most interesting stops. We crank that up for them and let them listen to it. It's been electrified now, so you don't have to pump the pedals anymore. But back in the day when Doris Gary did it, she used to pump the pedals, and I was told that she did that. She was up in her 90s, but she always played that for most of those years. And that was when she couldn't get outside and walk, she'd pump the pedals on that and play the player piano. The Victrola was another means that we had back then too. It was played the large records, that silver needle that you put on the record, but you had to keep it cranked up to keep it moving, to keep the turntable moving. So, you know, as it was dying down, you'd get this, this drawn out part of music, and you knew you had to go back and crank it up again. I had to throw Dick Clark's picture in there just 'cause. And then on the lower one, this is pretty much how kids today are hearing their music through their headsets or iPods or whatever they have. Okay. Here's early community band, marching band now. The Bloomer Girls. The Bloomer Girls came to Oregon, and they were a ladies' baseball team. And they played on a lot out at the end of Jefferson Street, in a lot out there. And, sorry?
There was a lot out there?
Well, back when they came, there was the open area. If you got past, you know, before you, actually where the open area is now, pretty much, there was an open field back there, and they played baseball out there. But they were a traveling team. Summerfest, we tend to think about that as being something kind of new, but actually back before World War II, they did have they didn't call it Summerfest, but they had a fall festival. And it was held, and if you look at the building up there, you can see that that's the Tri-County building, and it still was kind of set up in the hitching park like it used to be. And then there was a Standard Oil station right there, I think. But the firemen would do the festival, bring in the festival. Of course, it was a little more scaled back than you see today with the different rides, more tents, and I don't know if there was a beer tent out there or not, but there probably was even back then. We're just going to run through some school slides just to show you. We visited that first picture where the school was on North Main Street. This is the school display that we have at the museum, showing the desks that were one behind the other, kind of on a runner, connected to one another. This is precious. This is German de Bergenal, or PH Peter. This was one of the first school buses. This was the school, that we call it the tan one, that was the entire school through high school at that time. Then it was added on in the next picture. It came out from the east and kind of up to the north towards the Netherwood Farm. And here are some of our current ones. Now you're going to have to help me. Forest Edge, I can see the sign. Top right.
RCI corners.
What is it?
RCI corners.
Rome Corners, RCI.
A lot of left. Oregon Middle School.
Middle School.
Right,
Brooklyn.
Prairie View. The high school.
And I guess we stuck that one in. That was kind of related to the first one. And the red brick. Made it.
Thank you very much.
Who was in,
Sorry.
who was in Maria's Pizza Building before Maria?
Your dad.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna say
Shut
that.
up.
And didn't he have a feed store?
Pardon?
Did he sell grain and
No, plumbing and heating and
Plumbing.
surge milking machines.
Serge Marbringer was there?
Yeah, I saw one of his ads, in our old
Yeah.
observers. George, his name was George too, right?
Yes.
Yeah, I saw
But
one of his ads.
And
in
then
the old
Ellis,
Observer.
didn't Ellis sell the seed and so forth, the corn?
No,
I
it
don't know if
didn't
it's
have
in
nothing to do with corn.
Oh, okay.
There was a fellow in there after, or it might have been before my dad,
I think
that
before.
had corn.
Yeah.
I couldn't say his name right now.
Coming down there.
And when you talked about the old village hall right over here, that's here not yet,
Yes.
I had second grade in that building.
Oh, you did? Okay. I had first grade, but we were not.
First grade?
I had first grade.
First grade, I we had second grade.
You said what, 16?
It was a laundromat.
Oh, yeah. There was a laundromat there at Maria's.
Yes.
Yes.
Yep.
That would have been like in the 1967, I know I was there then.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
With your whole crew
Thank
here.
you.
Thank you for coming.